breaking news from the palace walls. And I need you to pay very close attention to what I'm about to tell you. Because this isn't just another royal scandal. This isn't just gossip or speculation or tabloid entertainment. This is about something far more fundamental. Whether we were all sold an elaborate fiction dressed up as royal history. If Meghan Markle's royal birth story were a movie, it wouldn't be a fairy tale. It'd be a satire. A dark comedy about how far someone will go to control a narrative, even when that narrative involves one of the most scrutinized institutions on Earth. Prince Harry's memoir, Spare, paints the moment of Archie's birth like a luxury spa session. Candles flickering softly, laughter filling the room, a warm bathtub ready for a peaceful water birth, and Harry casually dashing out at 2 a.m. for Nando's chicken between contractions. It sounds idyllic, doesn't it? Romantic. Modern. The perfect story for a couple rewriting royal tradition. But here's the problem. Behind the glow, nothing adds up. Not medically, not logistically, and certainly not according to centuries of royal protocol. Can you imagine this? You're told a story about a royal birth that breaks every tradition, violates multiple medical protocols, and conveniently avoids all the witnesses and documentation that normally accompany such a momentous event. And you're just supposed to accept it because it was wrapped in beautiful language about privacy and modernization. 2 epidurals? Medically bizarre. A duchess leaving Portland hospital unnoticed just 2 hours after giving birth? Logistically impossible. The Queen reportedly not being informed until after the birth? Constitutionally unprecedented. Every single detail sounds less like history and more like a script polished for PR and carefully edited to avoid anything that could be fact-checked or verified. Doctors say the timeline Harry described is impossible. Palace staff whisper that fundamental protocols were shattered. Even the Queen, the woman who must be notified the moment any royal goes into labor, reportedly raised quiet eyebrows when she realized she'd been left out of the loop. And when the birth certificate details started changing, names altered, doctors disputed, timelines adjusted, the story turned from confusing to downright suspicious. Each revision deepened the cracks in an already unbelievable tale. Commentators like Candace Owens looked at all of this and called it what it looked like, a royal performance dressed as a miracle. From glowing serenity to privacy, excuses that made no sense given royal requirements. Every scene felt choreographed. Every detail felt managed. Every inconsistency felt deliberate. But here's the question that's driving all of this investigation. Why rewrite the rules of royal tradition and reality, unless there's something worth hiding? Why avoid hospitals with witness protocols? Why change birth certificate details after the fact? Why describe a birth timeline that medical professionals say couldn't have happened the way it was described? Why keep the Queen uninformed until it was too late for anyone to verify anything? Now, whispers of an internal palace review suggest the story isn't over. Sources say Archie and Lilibet's records may hold the truth behind what could become the royal family's biggest mystery yet. Tonight, we're going to examine every piece of Candace Owens' bombshell evidence. Every medical impossibility in Harry's birth story. Every protocol violation that suggests something deeply wrong with the official narrative. Every reason why the palace's continued silence might be the most damning response possible. So, before we dive into the 2 epidural impossibility, the 2-hour hospital discharge that couldn't have happened, and the Nando's run that proves Harry's timeline doesn't work, I need you to ask yourself, if the birth of a royal heir was fabricated, what would that mean for everything else we've been told about the Sussexes? Because once you see the cracks in this story, you can't unsee them. And those cracks reveal something much darker than just a couple wanting privacy. Let's begin where Candace Owens began, with a birth story that sounded too perfect to be true. Because it was. Let's start with what Harry actually wrote in Spare about Archie's birth. Because this is where the entire story begins to unravel if you know anything about how childbirth actually works. According to Harry's memoir, Meghan went into labor and they headed to Portland Hospital, an exclusive private maternity facility in London favored by celebrities and royals. So far, so normal. But then the story gets strange. Harry describes the birthing room as dimly lit, with candles glowing softly. A birthing ball ready for use. A warm bathtub prepared for a potential water birth. The atmosphere described more like a wellness retreat than a medical facility preparing for a royal birth. Meghan had 2 epidurals, according to Harry. Not one that needed adjustment, 2 separate epidurals. And then, within 2 hours of Archie being born, they were home at Frogmore Cottage. Can you imagine this? Let me break down why every single medical professional who's read this account has raised immediate red flags. First, the 2 epidurals. Epidurals aren't something you get twice, like ordering coffee refills. When a woman receives an epidural, a catheter is inserted into her spine. That catheter stays in place, and medication is adjusted through that single line as needed. Stronger, weaker, different combinations, all delivered through one catheter. For Meghan to have had 2 epidurals, as Harry claims, a doctor would have needed to remove the first catheter, start the entire spinal procedure again from scratch, reinsert a new catheter, test it, and monitor her closely. All while she was in active labor. That almost never happens. It's rare, complicated, and would only be done in an emergency where the first epidural failed completely. And even then, it's such an unusual circumstance that it would be extensively documented in medical records. But Harry describes it casually, as if it's a normal part of the birth story. As if having 2 separate spinal procedures during labor is just how things go. Medical professionals reading this said immediately, "That doesn't make sense. That's not how epidurals work." Why would he include this detail unless he was told this by someone who doesn't understand the medical reality? Second, the timeline. Harry says they were home at Frogmore Cottage within 2 hours of Archie being born. Let's do the math, shall we? Portland Hospital to Frogmore Cottage is roughly a 1-hour drive on a good day. Maybe 45 minutes if traffic is perfect and you're driving fast. So if they were home 2 hours after birth, that means everything else, the birth itself, recovery from 2 epidurals, post-birth monitoring of both mother and baby, discharge paperwork, getting dressed, packing their things, security arrangements for leaving, all of that happened in 60 minutes or less. That is not possible. Not medically safe. Not permitted under any hospital protocol, especially at a facility like Portland that's known for being cautious and thorough. After giving birth, a woman needs to be monitored. Blood pressure, bleeding, recovery from anesthesia if epidurals were used. The baby needs to be assessed, APGAR scores, vitals, initial feeding. There are forms to sign, procedures to follow. Even in the fastest, smoothest births with no complications, hospitals don't discharge patients in under an hour. It's not about efficiency, it's about safety and legal liability. But Harry wants us to believe that after 2 epidurals, which would require extended monitoring, Meghan was up, dressed, and out the door with a newborn in less than 60 minutes. Can you imagine how that sounds to medical professionals? It sounds like someone who's never actually been present for a birth trying to construct a timeline that sounds plausible, but actually reveals they don't understand how any of this works. Third, the Nando's run. This is where Candace Owens really started asking pointed questions, because this detail alone breaks the timeline completely. Harry claims he slipped out at 2 a.m. to get Nando's chicken for the hospital room. Now, anyone familiar with Portland Hospital knows it has 24-hour private catering. You don't need to leave to get food. They'll prepare virtually anything you want at any hour. But even putting that aside, Nando's restaurants close around 11 p.m. They're not open at 2 a.m. So either Harry's timeline is wrong about when he went, or he went to a Nando's that wasn't actually open, or this entire detail is fabricated. When Candace Owens pointed this out, the response from Sussex supporters was predictable. Maybe he got the time wrong. Maybe he went earlier. Maybe it wasn't exactly 2 a.m. But that's the point. If you're writing a memoir about one of the most important moments of your life, the birth of your first child, and you can't get basic details like what time you want to get food and whether the restaurant was actually open, what else in the story is unreliable? Fourth, the atmosphere. Harry describes dim lighting, candles, a birthing ball, a peaceful, spa-like environment. But Portland Hospital protocol for high-risk births, which royal births automatically are, given the security and medical scrutiny required, involves bright lighting, full medical equipment ready, specialists on standby, and an atmosphere designed for rapid intervention if needed. The dreamy, candlelit scene Harry describes isn't what Portland does for high-risk cases. It's what you might get at a home birth or a birthing center designed for low-risk, natural deliveries. So either Portland completely abandoned their protocols for this particular birth, or the birth didn't happen at Portland the way Harry describes. Let me ask you, if you were telling the truth about a major life event, would you get basic facts wrong? Would your timeline fall apart under the slightest scrutiny? Would medical professionals immediately identify impossibilities in your account? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because we're just getting started with the inconsistencies. When we come back, we're going to look at what should have happened according to royal protocol and why every single protocol was mysteriously broken for this one birth. Stay with us. The evidence gets more damning from here. Royal births aren't just personal family moments. They're matters of constitutional significance, which is why, for centuries, there have been strict protocols governing how they happen, who's informed, and how everything is documented. And for Archie's birth, virtually every single one of those protocols was broken. Let's start with the most fundamental requirement. The Queen must be notified immediately when a royal goes into labor. Not after the birth. Not hours later. Immediately, as labor begins. This isn't tradition for tradition's sake. It's constitutional necessity. The monarch needs to know when a potential heir is being born so that proper documentation can begin, proper witnesses can be arranged, and the line of succession can be officially updated the moment the birth occurs. Can you imagine the importance of this? We're talking about children who could, theoretically, one day sit on the British throne. Their legitimacy must be beyond question. Their births must be witnessed and verified. There can be no possibility of fraud or substitution. That's why the Queen is always informed immediately. That's why royal births traditionally happen at known hospitals with royal medical staff. That's why there are witnesses and official announcements and very public presentations of the new baby shortly after birth. It's not about media spectacle. It's about constitutional legitimacy. But according to sources familiar with what happened, the Queen was not notified when Meghan went into labor. She learned about Archie's birth after the fact, when Harry called to tell her she was a great-grandmother. Think about how unprecedented that is. The monarch was kept out of the loop during the birth of a child in the direct line of succession. Either accidentally, which would be an astounding breach of protocol by everyone involved, or deliberately, which would be even more concerning. Why would you need to keep the Queen uninformed unless you didn't want official royal oversight of what was actually happening? Second protocol broken. Traditional royal births happen at the Lindo wing of St. Mary's Hospital, where royal medical staff are credentialed and where the entire process can be properly witnessed and documented. Meghan chose Portland Hospital instead, a private facility with no particular royal connections. Now, that's a right. There's no law saying royals must use the Lindo wing. But combined with everything else, the Queen not being informed, the lack of traditional witnesses, the unusual timeline, the choice to avoid the standard royal facility starts to look less like a preference and more like strategic avoidance of oversight. Third protocol broken. Royal births are announced through official channels, with doctors signing off on the documentation, and the baby is typically presented publicly within hours of birth. None of that happened with Archie. Instead, the announcement came hours after the reported birth, with Harry appearing alone to tell the media he had a son. No doctors. No medical staff to verify. No official documentation shown publicly. Just Harry's word. And when Meghan did finally appear with a baby 2 days later, it was at Windsor Castle in a carefully controlled photo opportunity. Not the traditional hospital steps presentation. No spontaneous moments. Everything staged and managed. Can you imagine how unusual this was? For centuries, royal babies have been presented publicly shortly after birth specifically to provide visual confirmation that the birth actually occurred, that the baby is healthy, that there's nothing being hidden. But the Sussexes opted out of all of that, citing privacy and modernizing the monarchy. Which would be fine if that's all it was. But when you combine the privacy excuse with the broken protocols, the impossible medical timeline, and the inconsistencies in Harry's story, It starts to look less like a legitimate desire for privacy and more like a need to avoid witnesses who might later contradict the official narrative. Fourth protocol broken. Birth certificates are official documents that don't get changed after the fact without very good reason. But Archie's birth certificate was altered multiple times, according to reports. Meghan's name was changed from Rachel Meghan to Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. Other details were modified. The questions arose about which doctor actually delivered the baby, with conflicting information in different versions of the documentation. Official royal documents don't get rewritten repeatedly unless something was wrong with the original version. Unless details needed to be adjusted to match a story that wasn't quite accurate from the start. Candace Owens looked at all of these protocol violations and asked the obvious question: why would you break every rule, avoid every traditional safeguard, and create a birth story that can't be properly verified unless you needed to hide something about what actually happened? And here's what makes the palace's silence so damning. They can't defend the protocol violations without admitting that yes, protocols were broken. They can't explain the inconsistencies without acknowledging that the official story has problems. So they've chosen to say nothing, to let the questions pile up unanswered, to hope that eventually people will stop asking. But people aren't stopping. Medical professionals aren't stopping. Investigators like Candace Owens aren't stopping. Because the more you look at what should have happened versus what actually happened, the clearer it becomes that something fundamental was being hidden. Let me ask you, if you were giving birth to a royal heir, would you want every protocol followed to protect your child's legitimate claim to their place in history? Or would you actively work to avoid those protocols? Comment below. Because the choice to break protocol tells us something important about what the Sussexes were trying to accomplish, or hide. When we come back, we're diving into the birth certificate alterations. The doctors who were listed then disputed. The names that changed. The documentation that keeps shifting as if someone is trying to get a story straight after the fact. This is where the evidence becomes impossible to explain away. Stay with us. Birth certificates are supposed to be straightforward documents. You fill them out accurately when the birth happens. You submit them to official record. And unless there's a genuine clerical error, they don't change. But Archie's birth certificate has been modified multiple times. And each modification raises more questions than it answers. Let's start with the name change. Originally, the birth certificate listed Meghan as Rachel Meghan Markle, her legal name. That's standard practice. Birth certificates use legal names, not titles or honorifics. But at some point after the birth, the certificate was altered. Rachel Meghan Markle was removed entirely and replaced with Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. Can you imagine how unusual that is? Birth certificates are legal documents. They're not branding opportunities or PR statements. They record facts. Who gave birth, when, where, with what medical professionals present. You don't typically use royal titles on birth certificates any more than you'd use someone's job title or nickname. You use legal names because birth certificates are foundational identity documents that need to match other official records. So, why was Meghan's name changed to a title instead of her legal name? Meghan later claimed the palace forced this change, that she never wanted it, and actually found it dehumanizing. Palace sources disputed this, saying Meghan's team requested the modification. Both sides can't be telling the truth. Someone is lying about who initiated this change and why. But here's what's really interesting. The change happened after the birth certificate was already officially filed, which means someone had to go back, submit modification requests, and get approval to alter an already completed legal document. Why would you do that unless the original version had information you needed to change for some reason? Unless there were details in the original filing that didn't match the story you wanted to tell? Then there's the doctor confusion. Birth certificates require listing the medical professional who delivered the baby. It's a fundamental piece of documentation, who witnessed and facilitated this birth. But reports about who actually delivered Archie have been inconsistent. Some media outlets initially reported it was one doctor. Then corrections were issued. Then different names appeared. Some doctors whose names were mentioned publicly denied being involved. This isn't a minor detail. This is who was present at a royal birth. Information that should be crystal clear, officially documented, and not subject to confusion or contradiction. But somehow, even the identity of the delivering physician became murky. Multiple names floated around. Denials were issued. Corrections had to be made. Can you imagine how that happens if the birth occurred normally at Portland Hospital with standard medical staff? Everyone would know exactly who was present. The doctor's name would be on official records. There would be no confusion. The fact that confusion exists suggests something abnormal happened. Either multiple doctors were involved in unexpected ways, or the birth didn't happen exactly as described, or documentation was handled differently than standard protocol requires. Candace Owens pointed out that in any normal birth, especially a high-profile royal birth, you'd have clear documentation. No confusion. No contradictions. No need to modify certificates or issue corrections about basic facts. The fact that Archie's birth documentation has been so messy suggests someone was trying to construct a paper trail after the fact to match a story that wasn't quite accurate from the beginning. And then there are the timeline adjustments. Different versions of the birth story have slightly different times listed. Not huge discrepancies, but enough that investigators noticed the inconsistencies. When exactly did labor start? When exactly did the birth occur? When exactly did Harry make his public announcement? The times don't quite line up across different official statements and media reports. Small discrepancies, yes. But in a story that's supposedly been carefully documented and officially verified, there shouldn't be any discrepancies. Let me give you a comparison. When Catherine gave birth to George, Charlotte, and Louis, every detail was immediately clear. Time of birth officially announced. Medical staff identified. Birth certificate filed promptly with no modifications. Public presentation hours after birth. Everything transparent and verifiable. With Archie, everything was murky, delayed, modified, contradicted, and shrouded in privacy. Explanations that didn't make sense given that royal births are inherently public constitutional events. The contrast is striking. And it raises the obvious question, why was Archie's birth so different from every other modern royal birth? Why all the confusion, modifications, and contradictions? Candace Owens' answer is simple. Because the story we were told doesn't match what actually happened. Because documentation keeps changing to try to make the narrative work. Because when you're constructing a fiction, you don't get all the details right the first time. Let me ask you, if you were documenting the birth of your child, would you need to modify the birth certificate multiple times? Would there be confusion about which doctor delivered your baby? Would basic facts keep changing? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because we're about to look at the most damning evidence yet, medical professionals explaining why Harry's birth story is medically impossible. When we come back, doctors are breaking down the timeline and showing exactly why what Harry described couldn't have happened the way he claims. Stay with us. Now we need to hear from the medical professionals. Because while protocol violations and documentation changes are suspicious, medical impossibility is definitive proof that something about the official story is wrong. Let's bring in what actual doctors have said about Harry's birth account. Dr. Sarah Chin, an OB/GYN with 20 years of experience, reviewed Harry's description in Spare and said bluntly, "This timeline doesn't work. Either Harry's memory is completely unreliable, or what he's describing didn't happen at Portland Hospital under standard medical protocols." Let's break down her analysis point by point. Can you imagine having two separate epidurals during one labor? Dr. Chin explains, an epidural catheter is placed into the epidural space of the spine. Once it's in, we adjust medication through that catheter. We can make it stronger, weaker, change drug combinations, all through the same line. The only reason to place a second epidural is if the first one completely failed, which is extremely rare, maybe 1 to 2% of cases. And if it happens, it's documented extensively because it's such an unusual complication requiring additional procedure consent and monitoring. She continued, for Harry to mention 2 epidurals so casually suggests either he misunderstood what was happening, or he's repeating information someone told him who doesn't understand the medical reality. No doctor would place 2 epidurals without extensive documentation, and no woman who actually experienced 2 separate spinal procedures would describe it as casually as Harry does. Second, the 2-hour discharge timeline. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who's worked in high-risk obstetrics for 15 years, said, "Absolutely impossible. After an epidural, let alone two, we monitor patients for hours. They can't walk until the anesthesia wears off enough that they have full motor control. We check blood pressure, bleeding, ensure the bladder is functioning properly. The baby needs monitoring, assessment, initial feeding attempts documented." He continued, "The absolute minimum time from birth to discharge in an uncomplicated vaginal delivery with no anesthesia would be about 4 to 6 hours, and that's pushing it. With epidural anesthesia, you're looking at 6 to 12 hours minimum before discharge is even considered. A 2-hour discharge after 2 epidurals? I would lose my medical license for releasing a patient that quickly. It's medically unsafe and legally indefensible." Can you imagine what he's saying here? Harry's timeline isn't just unlikely. It's something that would result in medical malpractice charges if a doctor actually allowed it. Third, the physical recovery. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a maternal-fetal medicine specialist, pointed out, after giving birth, especially with epidural anesthesia, women need time to recover basic physical functions. Legs are weak from the anesthesia. There's bleeding that needs monitoring. Many women experience dizziness or lightheadedness. The idea that Meghan could give birth, recover from 2 epidurals, get up, get dressed in a full outfit and makeup, and walk out of a hospital within 2 hours is medically absurd. She added, "And let's talk about the baby. Newborns need monitoring immediately after birth. Temperature regulation, breathing assessment, initial feeding, jaundice checks. These aren't optional procedures you can skip if you want privacy. They're medical necessities to ensure the baby is healthy and stable. Even in the fastest, smoothest births, the baby stays under observation for hours before discharge is considered." Fourth, the Portland hospital protocols, specifically. A former staff member at Portland, speaking anonymously, said, "Portland doesn't do rush discharges for anyone, let alone high-profile patients. Our protocols are strict precisely because we cater to wealthy clients who could sue us if anything goes wrong. The suggestion that we discharged a duchess and a royal baby in under 2 hours after a complicated delivery is insulting to our professional standards." The source continued, "And the description of candles and dim lighting? Portland's high-risk delivery rooms have full medical lighting, monitoring equipment, emergency instruments ready. We don't do candlelit spa births for celebrities. We do safe, professionally managed deliveries with every precaution in place. If Harry's description is accurate, it didn't happen in our facility under our protocols." Can you imagine what all of this means? Multiple medical professionals, looking at Harry's account from different specialties, all reaching the same conclusion. What he described is medically impossible, procedurally unacceptable, and couldn't have happened at Portland Hospital the way he claims. Candace Owens assembled all of this medical testimony and said, "We don't have to speculate about whether the birth story is true. Medical professionals are telling us definitively that it's not possible. The timeline doesn't work. The procedures don't work. The discharge doesn't work. Nothing about Harry's account matches medical reality." And here's the devastating follow-up question. If Harry's account is medically impossible, what actually happened? 3 possibilities exist. 1. Harry's memory is so unreliable, possibly due to his well-documented drug use, that he literally doesn't remember the birth accurately and instead created a false memory based on things Meghan told him or things he imagined. 2. The birth happened differently than described, possibly not at Portland at all, and the story was constructed after the fact to create a birth narrative that sounded royal and legitimate. 3. There was no natural birth at all. The pregnancy was carried by a surrogate, and every detail of the birth story is complete fiction designed to hide the use of a surrogate that would disqualify Archie from the line of succession. Medical professionals can't tell us which of these 3 possibilities is correct. But they can tell us definitively that what Harry described didn't happen the way he claims it did. Let me ask you, when multiple doctors from different specialties all say the same thing, that a story is medically impossible, do you believe them? Or do you assume they're all wrong and the person telling the impossible story is right? Comment below. Because we're about to look at why the palace can't just issue a statement clarifying all of this without creating even bigger problems. When we come back, we're examining why silence has become the palace's only option, and why that silence is the loudest admission of deception possible. Stay with us. Here's what makes this entire situation so uniquely damaging to the palace. They can't defend the official story without drawing even more attention to all the things that don't add up. Think about it from their perspective. Candace Owens has presented medical testimony showing Harry's birth story is impossible. Timeline analysis showing inconsistencies. Protocol violations that can't be explained. Documentation that keeps changing. Can you imagine being the palace communications team trying to figure out how to respond? If they issue a statement defending the official story, they'll have to address each specific claim, which means publicly acknowledging all the problems investigators have identified, which means giving even more oxygen to questions they'd prefer people stop asking. If they provide detailed medical documentation to prove the birth happened as described, they'd be setting a precedent for releasing private medical information.